Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's public event that's part of the Arabic Poetry and Story in Translation workshops that Marina and I organize. The event this evening's event is about Ingenuity and Artifice, Arabic Invention and Oulipian Strategies. And the event will have two guest speakers, and they'll be reading from their works and also engage in conversation about Arabic traditions of literary games and acrostics, puns, and inventive prosody. So I will introduce our first speaker, Professor Geert Jan van Gelder, who is a Dutch academic, and he was the Laudian Professor of Arabic at the University of Oxford between 1998 and 2012, and he was elected to the British Academy in 2005. His research moves across a wide range of topics within classical Arabic literature, especially the belles-lettres, right? They include Arabic tradition of literary criticism, poetics, rhetoric, and stylistics, the history of poetry and poetic genres, and the study of specific themes in poetry and literary prose. His publications, just to mention a few monographs, include Beyond the Line, Classical Arabic Literary Criticism, On the Coherence and Unity of the Poem. This came out in 1982. Of Dishes and Discourses, Classical Arabic Literary Representation of Food, right, 1999, Close Relationships, Incest and Inbreeding in Classical Arabic Literature, 2005, Sound and Sense in Classical Arabic Poetry, 2012, Classical Arabic Literature, a library of Arabic Anthology, 2012, and most recently, he's published a book on prominent murders in classical Arabic literature. So thank you, Geert Jan, for coming and for joining us. And I'll let Marina introduce our second speaker.
Yes, Phil Parry is an old colleague of mine from university, where he's still a professor at Essex University. And we've collaborated a great deal on many occasions. So I'm especially glad that Phil could join us for what is our first truly comparative workshop, because we have normally just had one Arabic writer and not had this opportunity to look across different techniques, across cultures and languages in the way that we hope to do. You'll hear tonight. Phil is the greatest Oulipian since in England, since going really quite far back, because Oulipo itself started in 1960, and I think you began writing these Oulipian texts in the 80s, is that right? Perhaps the 90s? Anyway, you've since become the editor of this extraordinary, remarkable collection of Oulipian works in translation, which has had, I think, a huge impact on readers understanding the breadth. And we were very interested that Geert Jan's work showed how many points of comparison and echoes and conversational exchanges there had been independently, of course, between these two forms of approaches to literature. So we'll first start with Geert Jan, and then we'll hear from Phil.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for being present in this electronic form. As I mentioned before, excuse me, in the workshop part of this exercise earlier today, we dealt with various kinds of wordplay in classical Arabic, lipograms, paranomasia, pangrams, double entendre, alliteration, acrostic. Well, I could go on. It's a bit difficult to talk about these things, especially when you have to explain all the puns and things. So, but when I heard that Philip Terry would be part of this event, the editor of this book that was just shown, I can show you the back. This is interesting Oulipian title. So I decided to devote this public part to Arabic precursors of Raymond Queneau's Exercices de Style, a very important Oulipian text, which has long been a favorite of mine. Phil Terry will tell you more about Oulipo later. Exercices de style, as you may know already, consists of 99 variations on a trivial story, published in 1947. A good year, I was born in it myself. It has been translated into or adapted in some 35 languages, including English, twice, I think, and Dutch by Rudy Kousbroek. Unfortunately, not into Arabic, as far as I know, and someone ought to give it a try. Queneau's trivial incident is about a man who addresses another man about his dress, first on a bus in Paris and again later that day at a train station. But more than a millennium prior to Queneau, from the 9th century onward, Arabic writers composed exercises in various professional idioms. Oulipians would call this a case of anticipatory plagiarism. The great prose writer Xaxis, who died in 868 or 869, he gives examples of how people with different trades and idioms say, "We met the enemy in battle and killed them in no time in a narrow and crowded place," in prose. And this is followed somewhat incongruously by a poem, a declaration of love in verse. One can be reasonably sure that the whole thing, the prose and the verse, was composed by Xaxis himself, although he does not say so. I shall come back to this text later and offer a partial translation. Like Queneau's exercises, the text in Xaxis' epistle are translations themselves, not from one language into another, but from, you could say, from one lingo into another, within one language. So they are exercises in linguistics. I can mention only a few of the many later examples. Tawhidi in the early 11th century gives some 20, or perhaps 10th century, he gives some 20 definitions of Sheba in Arabic, means satiety, having had enough. By a Sufi mystic, a theologian, a sponge or parasite, a Bedouin, a physician, a fuller, a sailor, a miser, an ascetic, a man from Medina, one from Samarkand, an Indian, a muleteer, and a camel driver. They're not particularly funny. The genre found its way in famous textbooks of on grammar and rhetoric, such as the famous Miftah al-Ulum, the key to the sciences, by Sakaki, who died in 1229. It's in a chapter on the semantic coherence of a text, and he is followed by al-Khatib al-Qazwini, who died a century later, the author of a very popular textbook on rhetoric. Just to give a shortened, less flowery version of a passage. It's less flowery than the Sakaki passage. This is from this book by al-Khatib al-Qazwini. It is told that a royal armorer, Sahib Salah Malik, a goldsmith, a dairy farmer, and a schoolmaster were traveling together. They went by day and continued when night fell. In the gloomy darkness, while they were feeling fearful, afraid to wander and lose their way, the full moon rose with its light. Each one poured forth praise on it, comparing it to whatever he possessed in his store of images. The goldsmith compared it to an ingot of pure gold, its face revealed by the crucible. The dairy farmer compared it to a white cheese, freshly taken from its mold. The schoolmaster compared it to a loaf of white bread, sent to him by one of his pupil's parents. Likewise, a copyist, I'm still translating from Khatib al-Qazwini. Likewise, a copyist thus described his situation. My subsistence is narrower than an inkwell, my body thinner than a ruler, my status more brittle than glass, my fortune more concealed than the split in the pen's nib, my physique weaker than a reed, my food more bitter than gall, my drink blacker than ink, misfortune more clinging to me than glue. So each speaker illustrates his words in a figure that in rhetoric is called mura'at al-nazir, observing the equivalent. That means harmonious choice of ideas or images. Much later, centuries later, an erotic version is offered by the polymath as-Suyuti, who died in 1505, in his Rashf al-Zulal min al-Halal, sipping pure water from licit magic. He composed 20 short chapters in rhymed prose and poetry, in which 20 bridegrooms describe the consummation of their marriage on their wedding night. They are a Quran reciter, a Quranic exegete, a specialist in the hadith, the prophetic tradition. What else have we got? A lexicographer, dialectician, a specialist in Islamic Islamic legal theory, grammarians, rhetoricians, statisticians, an accountant, a chancery scribe, an astronomer, a physician, a logician, and finally a Sufi mystic. Excuse me. Recently, I remarked to Philip Terry that I found it interesting to note the difference between Queneau and the Arab text. The former intentionally uses a very banal sartorial theme. It's all about style than content, I would say, whereas there are perhaps no subjects that matter more in the minds of traditional male Arabs, and perhaps other authors, than war, love, and sex. He replied by pointing out that fashion and clothes are very important in France, and that Queneau's book was written during World War II, and that the Gestapo often arrested people on buses. In the book, the bus is the S bus, and apparently in a draft it was the SS bus. Perhaps this was in Queneau's mind. I was a bit disappointed about this possible deeper meaning. I happen to be fond of the occasional silliness and pointlessness of literary artifacts, just to be free briefly from the obligatory, compulsory, almost compulsive search for deeper layers that is the mainstay of modern literary critics in order to make the texts and themselves more respectable. I've seen too much over-interpretation in my lifetime, and I had the same feeling of being let down a little bit when it was pointed out to me earlier today, it was mentioned too by Phil Terry, that according to some critics, Georges Perec's famous book, La Disparition, the book without the letter E, is really about the disappearance of those who died in the Second World War and the Holocaust, since the French letter E sounds like they. Now, I don't know if this was in Perec's conscious mind, but let us celebrate silliness for its own sake. So let us now look at Xaxis' exercices de style that I spoke about. They are from his epistle Sana'at al-Quwwat, the crafts of the masters, passages in prose and poetry, spoken by a groom, a physician, a tailor, a farmer, a schoolteacher, a bath attendant, a street sweeper, a wine steward, a cook, and a domestic servant. The prose is plain, variations on a very simple and short narrative. As I said, they all say in their own way, we met the enemy in battle and killed them in no time in a narrow and crowded place. And then the poetry that follows quite incongruously, they are love poems, complaints with the keywords of separation and lovers' aloofness or rejection, bain and sod, and forsaking, abandoning, hadj, or lovers' union, wasl, all of which occur in grotesque genitive metaphors, genitive similes in which the x of y means the y is, which is like x. I'll give many examples, of course. Even though Al-Jahiz was not known as a poet, the doggerel poems are obviously by him, modeled on some poems by Abu Nuwas, the great poet who died in 813 or thereabout, that employ similar farcical genitive constructions. The whole text is clearly fictional, even though at least one person, Bourdieu, the physician, was a contemporary, and the others may also have been real persons. The poems too are certainly by Al-Jahiz, although he is not usually called a poet. As is made explicit at the beginning and the end of the text is meant not only to entertain, but to instruct. Even princes should be taught, not the trades and professions themselves, but at least the language and the idioms that go with them. The text I find mildly amusing, and I must admit that I found Queneau's exercises much funnier and more brilliant. And now I'm going to try to put the text on screen with this screen share. I had some difficulties earlier, so bear with me and see if I can. I made a PDF which has the my English translation, unpublished I should say, on the left hand, and then the Arabic on the right hand side, but it may well be too small for you to read properly, but we'll see what happens. So the author, Al-Jahiz, he addresses the caliph at the time, which is Al-Mu'tasim, the son of Harun al-Rashid. He reigned between 833 and 842. So tell your children, commander of the believers, to learn about all kinds of knowledge. For if you instruct them in only one kind, they will be unable to respond if they're asked about other kinds. When you, commander of the believers, returned from the Byzantine territories, I met Hizam, the groom. I think the name is a pun because Hizam could mean strap or girth of a saddle. I asked him how things had gone, and he replied, we met him in battle in a place the size of a stable yard. In less than the time it takes a man to brush his horse, we had left them in a place narrower than a paddock. We killed them and made them into dung heaps. If you had dropped a mule's dropping, it would have fallen on a mule's tail. And then a man made a love poem. For what the reason is not quite clear, but it's a nice exercise. My beloved's aloofness may have destroyed my body's manger, but my heart is still filled with the passion's fodder. I'm a man in the fetters of love, curved by the bridle of being forsaken, reined to sickness. Cover me with a noble caparison of union with you, or grant me good slumber, for sleep is shackled. He struck the hobbling rope of union when he appeared, holding the scalpel of aloofness with both hands unsheathed. After this, I put on the blinkers of separation, the stable of affection, where the dung of love is scattered. Now, some people, such as Douglas Hofstadter, who wrote in his Le Tombeau de Marot in praise of the music of language, that metrical rhymed prose should always be translated as metrical rhymed poetry. Poetry should be made to conform to the original in terms of rhyme and meter, and that not doing so, in his words, is daffy or bonkers. Well, in my view, it depends. A crib is often useful, and it's normally impossible to imitate Arabic monorhyme. But in this case, and it's the only poem that I translated into the rhymed version, is on the screen again with the same Arabic, of course. My love's aloofness spoiled my body's manger's ration, but still my heart is filled with fodder for my passion. I'm a man who's hobbled by his love, restrained, who is forsaken and by sickness reined and reined. Ah, cover me with union's horsecloth and its tackle, or grant me slumber, for my sleep is in a shackle. He struck the fetter of our union, severing the strands, holding the scalpel of aloofness in his hands. The blinkers of forsakenness I must endure, while scattered on my stable floor lies love's manure. I should mention that the beloved in this and the following poems is always male. An Israeli scholar, Joseph Sadan, who published a very nice article on this and similar texts some decades ago, he remarks on the masculine form of the imperative of this poem, that such forms are used to address a woman in Arabic poetry. I must admit that sometimes this is the case, but from the 8th century onwards, the beloved in countless Arabic poems is a young male, and there is no reason to doubt that such is intended here. So it must be about a young boy. So I continue. I will not read the whole epistle, but just well, more than half of it, I think. I asked Bochtishor, as a physician, as a Christian, or as you can see from his name, about the same event. He replied, we met him in a place the size of the hospital courtyard. In less than twice the time a man spends at the privy, we had left them in a place narrower than the spout used to administer an enema. We killed so many of them that if you had dropped a scalpel, it would have fallen on the median vein of a man's arm. He also composed a love poem. Our union has drunk a dose of separation, and the belly of being united has been loosened by a flux. My love has struck me with a colic of parting that makes me oblivious to the blame of reproaches. The heart of my beloved has been dissolved by phthisis, and my own heart is tormented by ennui, apparently a medical condition. My heart is affected with pleurisy, sickly. Oh, Ibn Masawayh, another Christian physician. I'm at my wit's end. If Hippocrates or Galen suffered what I suffer, they would spend the night in a most abject state. I also asked Jaffa, the tailor, about the same event. He replied, we met him in a place the size of the rag market. In less than the time it takes one stitch to stitch a seam, we had killed them and left them in a place narrower than a shirt's collar. If we had dropped a needle, it would have fallen on a man's head. He also composed a love poem. You have torn the seams of passion by forsaking me, when the needle of aloofness pricked me. The tightness of his trousers made my heart stumble over the trouser strings of my pains. Oh, hood of distance from me, you have burned me with the breech bands of my ardor. The toggles of my eyes are connected to the loops of the tears on my cheeks. Oh, thimble and oh, collar of my heart, remembering your promise tormented me. The sharp-edged scissors of separation have cut the promised union with him. Oh, trouser tie and oh, hem of my soul, I must be joined with you. Oh, shirt collar of my joy and oh, pocket of my life, you have strayed from how I knew you. So I skipped the farmer, the baker, and the school teacher. and I move on to the bath attendant. He also asked Ali ibn Jahm, ibn Yazid about the same. He was a bath attendant. He said, we met him in a place the size of the undressing room. In less than the time a man takes to wash his head, we left them in a spot narrower than the opening of the fireplace. If one had dropped a loofah, it would have fallen on the man's head. He also made a love poem. Oh, depilatory paste of forsaking, you removed the hair of friendship when the loofah of aloofness appeared. Oh, loincloth of sicknesses, how much longer will you soak in a basin of pains? Soak the oven of union with me one more time with a bucket of affection. For since you heated its hammam, the undressing room of ardor has stirred my heart. The shampoo of friendship and love has been spoiled by the waste or the scum that broke the pledge. I also asked Al-Hasan ibn Abi Qumasha about the same. He was a street sweeper, or perhaps the text seems to suggest that he was a privy cleaner. He said, we met him in a place the size of the floor of the portico. I don't know what place this is. In less time than it takes a man to sweep up a basketful, we had left them in a spot narrower than the whole of a privy. And then we killed them in less time than it takes 2 men to clean a loo. If you had thrown a woodlouse, it would have fallen on the hole of a drain. He also composed a poem. My heart has turned into a drain pipe of passion in which the ass of separation has shat. The woodlice of love are more able to endure misery than I can endure the ardor in my heart. The dung beetles of forsaking have bereaved me on the day he turned away from me and my composure. The maggots of passion sickened my soul when separation shat on my life. Now I shall omit the wine steward, the cook, and the domestic servant. As I said, among the later authors of such exercises is the polymath and polygraph Suyuti, who died in 1505, with his sipping limpid water from licit magic. In the introduction, written in rhymed prose, the narrator, a certain Abu Durr Nafis, son of Abu Idris, fictional no doubt, he says that he, together with some young friends, went to a mosque on a feast day. After the salat, the imam ascended the pulpit, reminding the people of Islamic duties, recommending marriage, forbidding fornication and homosexual intercourse. Marriage, as in all religions, is a good thing, perpetuated in the hereafter. Sex between men is a great sin. And then 2 anonymous 2-line epigrams condemning pederasty are quoted, and a short poem of 8 lines contrasting homosexual intercourse with that between the male and female is quoted. His audience repents, apparently having succumbed to the sin of pederasty in the past. And the preacher produces a number of suitable brides. Weddings take place. On the morrow after the wedding night, each husband is asked to describe what happened. In the rest of the text, which is about 120 pages, much longer than the Xaxis text, 20 men of different trades and professions speak in rhymed prose and poetry about their sexual encounter in pretty graphic descriptions. There are a Quran reciter, a Quranic exegete, I think I mentioned them already, all these people, the lexicographer, the grammarians, and so on, the calligrapher, and so on. Now, the Arabic lexicon is so vast and studded with obscure words, and the ways of making ingenious figurative expressions are so manifold that the text does not often look clearly obscene or pornographic, except to the reader who knows all these difficult words and expressions, and who is able to interpret all the metaphors and similes, and to recognize the punning allusions to numerous book titles and technical terms pertaining to the various disciplines and trades. But Arabic equivalents of English 4-letter words, which are 2 or 3-letter words in Arabic, are by no means absent in the graphic descriptions of genitals. But if I don't translate some specimens, it is not out of prudery, but because of these exercices, these exercises are almost impossible to translate. The words of the explanatory notes would vastly outnumber those of the original. And so I shall give you only the short passage spoken by the Sufi mystic, the last speaker. It happens to be the easiest to translate and happens to be entirely chaste in diction, and I have not attempted to imitate the rhymed prose. The mystic said, it's on your screen if you can read it, although we are the people of revelation and inquiry about every divine attribute, I'm held to be silent, to stay housebound, to let down a covering and not to reveal mysteries. But we have symbols and allusions, which are the keys to treasures. When manifestation and revelation occurred, I beheld charms that are too exalted to be described. It was pleasant to be at this mystical station, and the wine was pure, the veil was removed, a close union took place, and love was the fruit. We became one without incarnation or oneness. And then he quotes the line, something happened which I shall not mention. Think well of it and do not ask about it. فكان ما كان مما لست أذكره فظن خيرا ولا تسأل عن الخبر. This is in fact a famous verse from a love poem by the poet and Abbasid prince Abdallah ibn Mu'taz, who was killed in 908, having been caliph for one day and a night. He refrains in his poem from speaking about what happened. And here I also refrain from speaking more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geert Jan. I think we'll have questions at the end, actually. Can you all try and remember if you have questions and keep them for Geert Jan later? Because I think we'll go now to Philip Terry, please.
Here we go. Okay, so those of you who were here earlier on will have heard me introduce Oulipo, the workshop of potential literature, l'oeuvre de littérature potentielle, saying that fundamentally they are concerned with writing using constraints and using wordplay, generating stories out of elaborate puns, for example, something which broadly speaking links Oulipo with certain aspects of Arabic literature. One of the examples of an Oulipian constraint that came up earlier was writing without using the letter E, called a lipogram. This may sound like a nightmare, but years of practice and experiment both within and outside Oulipo have proven that such techniques can actually help people to produce creative work. Georges Perec, who wrote a famous novel without using the letter E, La Disparition, or A Void, in Gilbert Adair's English rendering, originally started this as a way of overcoming writer's block. And when he was composing early drafts of the novel at a writer's retreat at the Moulin d'Andé in Normandy, he would often invite other guests at this place to contribute sentences without E's, and then he would incorporate these in his novel. So for this session, Marina Warner asked us to pick out some exemplary texts, and to illustrate Oulipo, or Oulipian writing, I've picked out a few texts that both typify Oulipian methods and that have had particular importance for me. I'll begin with an old piece, what Oulipo would call an example of anticipatory plagiarism. That is an example of Oulipo that precedes Oulipo's founding. The passage in question occurs in Gulliver's Travels in the Voyage to Laputa, and it was included in Oulipo's first collective publication in the Dossier 17 of the Collège de Pataphysique, which came out in 1961. It's a passage which describes a kind of proto-computer, which is of course the subject of satire in Swift. Though the kind of writing it points towards, one that involves permutation and combination, is one Oulipo took very seriously. So I'm not sure they saw the satire in this, but it's a nice passage. You may know it. It's the longest thing I'm going to read. The others are short, thankfully, but this is a page and a half. But it's from Gulliver's Travels. We crossed a walk to the other part of the academy, where, as I've already said, the projector and speculative learning resided. The first professor I saw was in a very large room with 40 pupils about him. After salutation, observing me to look earnestly upon a frame which took up the greatest part of both the length and breadth of the room, he said perhaps I might wonder to see him employed in a project for improving speculative knowledge by practical and mechanical operations. But the world would soon be sensible of its usefulness, and he flattered himself that a more noble, exalted thought never sprung in any other man's head. Everyone knew how laborious the usual method is of attaining to arts and sciences, whereas by his contrivance, the most ignorant person at a reasonable charge and with a little bodily labour may write books in philosophy, poetry, politics, law, mathematics, and theology without the least assistance from genius or study. He then led me to the frame, about the sides whereof all his pupils stood in ranks. It was 20 foot square, placed in the middle of the room. The Superfases was composed of several bits of wood, about the bigness of a die, but some larger than others. They were all linked together by slender wires. These bits of wood were covered in every square with paper pasted on them, and on these papers were written all the words of their language in their several moods, tenses, and declensions, but without any order. The professor then desired me to observe, for he was going to set his engine at work. The pupils, at his command, took each of them hold of an iron handle, whereof there were 40 fixed round the edges of the frame, and giving them a sudden turn, the whole disposition of the words was entirely changed. He then commanded 6 and 30 of the lads to read the several lines softly as they appeared upon the frame. And when they found 3 or 4 words together that might make part of a sentence, they dictated to the 4 remaining boys who were scribes. The work was repeated 3 or 4 times, and at every turn the engine was so contrived that the words shifted into new places as the square bits of wood moved upside down. 6 hours a day, the young students were employed in this labor, and the professor showed me several volumes in large folio already collected of broken sentences, which he intended to piece together, and out of those rich materials to give the world a complete body of all arts and sciences, which, however, might be still improved and much expedited if the public would raise a fund for making and employing 500 such frames in legado, and oblige the managers to contribute in common their several collections. He assured me that this invention had employed all his thoughts from his youth, and that he had emptied the whole vocabulary into his frame and made the strictest computation of the general proportion there is in the book between the numbers of particles, nouns, and verbs and other parts of speech. I made my humblest acknowledgement to this illustrious person for his great communicativeness, and promised, if ever I had the good fortune to return to my native country, that I would do him justice as the sole inventor of this wonderful machine, the form and contrivance of which I desired to leave to delineate upon paper, as in the figure here annexed. I told him, although it were the custom of our learned in Europe to steal inventions from each other, who had thereby at least this advantage that it became a controversy which was the right owner, yet I would take such caution that he should have the honor entire without rival. So the idea of permutation and combination, which you meet here in Swift, has been important for all sorts of Oulipian experiments. Most famously in Raymond Queneau's 100,000 billion poems, where the lines of 10 sonnets can be shuffled and recombined to give more sonnets than you could read in a lifetime. In a little collection of books in a box I did recently, there were some things of this type, and one of these is here. It's a kind of word wheel which allows you to change aphorisms to make a different sense. I don't know if you can see this. The original aphorism is by William James. Can't remember what it was. Something like the word dog does not bite. And I don't know if you can see this, but there's a wheel, and the wheel was designed by Tom Jenks, who runs Zimzala Press, who brought this out. And as you turn the wheel, you get different aphorisms. So you get the word door does not open, and you turn it around and you get something else. The word fire does not burn. You turn it around again, you get something else. The word fish does not swim. And if you turn it around again, you get the word rice does not grow. The word iron does not rust, and so on. So it's a little permutational machine that is very much like the Swift and like exemplifies Oulipo's idea of combinatory literature. The second thing I'll mention is a book by Raymond Queneau called Elementary Morality, or Morale Élémentaire. This was his last published book of poems, originally published in French in 1975, and came out in English in 2007. I was astonished to find at the time no one had bothered to translate this, because it's one of his great books. Anyway, so it's been available in English since 2007, and here Queneau invents a form, a sort of poetic form, sometimes called the quenet, because it is one more line than a sonnet. It is 15 lines, sometimes called The Elementary Morality after the title of the book, sometimes called The Lipoleps, from Greek leaving out and then taking in. It's basically a poem made up of noun adjective pairs, like red chair or black dog, plus a kind of refrain of 7 lines in the middle, a bit like an extended haiku, usually between 2 and 7 syllables in length. This is a key example of a new form invented by Oulipo. So as well as looking at forms that exist in the past that they could reuse, Oulipo were intent on trying to invent new literary forms. And this poem is one of them. And as such, it operates as a new constraint, I suppose. Queneau in his notebooks records that it actually came about through what he described as a very un-Oulipian route, which he said was inspiration. He was inspired to write this, it just came to him. But he also notes in his notebook that it can be used to faire l'Oulipo, to do Oulipo, as it has been by many others, both inside and outside Oulipo. If I screen share, I can just show you 1 or 2 of these. It's important to see it because it's got a kind of visual layout. You see, this is the first one in the book, and you can see it's got a kind of, it's set in Egypt. There's a boat going along what must be the Nile, and a crocodile. It mentions Isis a couple of times. So that's the landscape. And I think there are no rules about how you read this, but I would read it like this: dark Isis, green fruit, spotted animal, clear neologisms, red flower, transparent attitude, orange colored star, clear springs, brown forests, russet boar, bleating flock, sparse tree, a boat on the water, Solabrius follows the current, a crocodile bites the keel in vain, ochre Isis, crumbly statue, apricot totem, clear neologisms. I was going to show you another of those, but I won't. I'll move on. So you get the idea. Anyway, the quenet, as I'll call it for me, is a key Oulipian form in that it has potential to be used by other writers to do their own writing, and it has been by several poets in the UK, including James Davies, Peter Hughes, and Robert Shepherd, who did a rather nice 6 quenets for 4 walls, a floor, and a ceiling in one of his books, which became a kind of visual piece. Yeah, Marina asked us to talk about some of our own writing, so I'm saying I've used this form several times, and I used it. I found it was very useful to record walks. You can use it as a kind of sketchbook or notebook. As you're walking along somewhere, you know, you might not have time to write a lot down, but you can always spot a red boat or a blue fence and make a note of that, and then it can turn into one of these poems. So it's sort of writing you can do as you're literally as you're walking. I found it quite a good form to record walks. Here, I'll read you one of these, which turns it into a block of prose, but otherwise the form's almost exactly the same. So it's a flattened out version of this. This was written while walking around the Berlin Wall. So it's a Mauerweg. And here's one of these from the Berlin Wall. If I can find it. So this, once you flatten it out, you can probably see, I don't know if you can see that. Just looks like a bit of prose rather than the shape Queneau's has. Anyway, it goes like this: ground floor facades, tenement houses, extensive construction work, archaeological remnants, escape tunnels, slight rise, concrete bed, last generation, contrasting appearance, observant viewer, new constructions, urban trace. A bald man haunts the border strip here. They say his hair fell out overnight when the border was opened. Now he forever paces the former frontier, as if in search of his lost hair. Indirect testimony, terminal loop, former building, young trees. And you find there are lots of these sort of urban myths that accumulate around the Berlin Wall, and that was one of them. The third thing I want to talk about, which we've been introduced to a minute ago by Geert Jan, was Queneau's Exercises in Style. I'll read you 3 of these. Published in 1947, it's another key Oulipian work where he tells a single story about an argument on a bus in 99 different ways. It was inspired by, there's the original French copy. It was inspired by a concert of Bach's Art of the Fugue at the Salle Pleyel, which Queneau attended with Michel Leiris. Queneau saw how Bach took a seemingly trivial theme and made great music out of doing endless variations on this. And he wondered if something similar could be done in literature. Of course, this is really common in music, to have a theme with variations. There's the Diabelli variations of Beethoven and lots of other things. So working with constraints and with repetition and with exercises in style is precisely what all music does in a way. But Queneau thought it hadn't been done in literature. Of course, he didn't know these great Arabic texts, perhaps, which had already done it. But exercises in style was Queneau's answer to that wondering. And I will read you 3 of these. They're very short. So the first one is, he calls notations, which just tells the story in a note-like form. And then I'll read you the one that does it from sense of smell, and then the lipogram. So notations, here's the basic story. In the S bus, at this time, French buses had letters rather than numbers. They now have numbers. In the S bus in the rush hour, a bloke about 26, felt hat with a cord instead of a ribbon, neck too long as if someone had been tugging at it, people getting off. The bloke in question gets annoyed with one of the passengers standing next to him. He accuses him of bumping into him every time someone goes past, a whining tone, which is meant to sound menacing. When he sees a vacant seat, he grabs it. 2 hours later, I came across him in the Cour de Rome in front of the Gare Saint-Lazare. He's with a friend who's saying, you should get another button put on your overcoat. He shows him where, at the lapels, and why. Of course, the cunning thing Queneau's doing here, which is easily missed because it's so obvious, is that he's doing exercises in style, in different literary style, but the subject of the story in a way is fashion, is style in that sense. Here's the one that's all about smell. Same story, but everything is about smell. In that meridian S, besides the usual smells, those of priests, the deceased, eggs, jaywalkers, drunks, snorers, nutters, wings, hate-filled flatulence, unpopular songs, empty verses, French letters, and impetuous kebab eaters, there was a distinct odor of long, juvenile neck, of the sweatiness of plaited cord, a pungency of anger, a certain loose and constipated stench, smells that were so unmistakable in combination that when 2 hours later I passed in front of the Gare Saint-Lazare, I recognized them at once and traced them to the cosmetic, modish and tailored perfume, which was given off by a single badly placed button. And the lipogram, I don't know if you can guess what letters are missing, probably not, but maybe, lipogram. This was added to the 1970s edition where Queneau sort of Oulipianized this book, which had originally come out in 1947. Lipogram on an S bus, rush hour, a guy about 26, soft hat with a cord around it, scruff too long as if caught in a tug of war, a woman and child alight. Said guy angry with the man standing in front of him, arraigns him for bumping into him as folk push by, a whining intonation that sounds intimidating. Said guy grabs an opportunity to sit down without compunction. 2 hours on, I cross his path again in front of a station. A companion who sports a similar hat is saying to him, "You should put an additional button on your coat." His companion shows him at what spot towards his collar and why. So those are some of the exercises in style. I think it's worth saying that these variations of Queneau's have over the years become a kind of foundational text for Oulipo, and they've inspired other members of Oulipo to devise other works similarly based on the idea of variation. So there's a series of lots and lots of different variations, all describing the Mona Lisa, for example. Collectively, Oulipo have written numerous variations on a story, a very tiny story by Perret called A Winter Journey. And Calvino's marvelous Invisible Cities, essentially a series of variations all describing Venice, told by Marco Polo to Kubla Khan, is in fact a work of this kind, though it's not always recognized as such. And here's one of Calvino's short narratives from that book, Invisible Cities. This is Cities and Memories too, it's very short. When a man rides a long time through wild regions, he feels the desire for a city. Finally, he comes to Isidora, a city where the buildings have spiral staircases encrusted with spiral seashells, where perfect telescopes and violins are made, where the foreigner hesitating between two women always encounters a third, where cockfights degenerate into bloody brawls among the betters. He was thinking of all these things when he desired a city. Isidora, therefore, is the city of his dreams, with one difference. The dreamed of city contained him as a young man. He arrives at Isidora in his old age. In the square, there is the wall where the old men sit and watch the young go by. He is seated in a row with them. Desires are already memories. One of my favorite books, that by Calvino, it's just magical. Fourth and final thing I want to mention as an exemplary Oulipian text, though there are thousands of others, is I Remember by Georges Perec, Je me souviens, published in 1979, around the same time as he published Life a User's Manual. So I Remember uses another Oulipian technique called which they call the kickstart, or it's called the kickstart in English, where a single phrase is repeated at the start of each sentence. Here I remember. So Perec got the idea from the New York artist Joe Brainard, who wrote a book of the same title. Though Perec's memories are much less personal than Brainard's. Many of them are memories that Perec would have shared with many other people living at the same time as he did. In this sense, they're often collective memories. There's nobody except Georges Perec who would have had these precise 480 memories, which make up the book. So it becomes, although many of the memories are shared, in this strange way, it becomes a unique memoir. Here's a little bit of, just a few of those, if you don't know them. I Remembers, they're often called. Here are some of the opening ones. I remember Reda Kerr performing live at the Porte de Saint Cloud cinema. I remember that my uncle had an 11 CV with the registration number 7070RL2. I remember the cinema, Les Agriculteurs, and the leather armchairs at the Camera, and the twin seats at the Panthéon. I remember Lester Young at the Club Saint-Germain. He wore a blue silk suit with a red silk lining. I remember Ronconi, Brambilla, and Jesus Mujica, and Zaf, the perennial red lantern. They're all cyclists. I remember that Art Tatum called the piece Sweet Lorraine because he had been in Lorraine during the 1914-18 war. I remember clackers. I remember a one-armed Englishman who beat everyone at ping pong at the Chateau d'Eau. I remember plume, plume, tralala. I remember that a friend of my cousin Henri spent all day in his dressing gown when he was studying for his exams. I remember the citizen of the world, Gary Davis, tapping away on his typewriter at the Place du Trocadéro. I remember games of Barbu at Les Petites Dalles. I remember the 3 Cs, Metz, Toul, and Verdun. I remember the yellow bread there was for a while after the war, because there was no flour available after the war, so the French had to import corn flour. Quelle horreur. I remember the earliest pinball machines called flippers in French, but they didn't have any flippers. I remember old issues of L'Illustration. I remember the pickup needles on record players made of steel, and ones made of bamboo, which you had to sharpen on an abrasive strip after every record. That's certainly one that I can't remember. I've never encountered bamboo pickups on record players, but I take Perrec's word for it. So finally, Oulipo have gone on to invent other kickstarts or texte à démarreur, such as I don't remember, I think, and so on. And you could invent your own ad infinitum. Let's agree, I sometimes wonder, and so on. This use of repetition, repetitive phrases, and so on is something we find echoes of in much older literature. So in the King James Bible, there were lots of sentences of this kind. So kickstarts are very old things. You find it also in the poems of Walt Whitman, who uses the phrase "I see" in his poem "Salut au monde," and you can find it in Arabic poems. Geert Jan will no doubt be able to furnish us with some examples. I came across an example in, I'll say this incorrectly, Abu al-Attaya. Every summary has a trend. This is a poem. Every summary has a trend. Every question has an answer. Every event has an hour. It's a similar kind of patterning, which was in an ancient Pelican anthology of Islamic literature I came across, which I think is not always perfectly, the translations aren't always perfect. I was talking with Geert Jan about this, and he gave some slightly better translations of that particular piece. If we're pressed for time, we can stop there. If we're not pressed for time, I can just read you a bit, I think a wonderful passage from Whitman where he uses one of these, which will take about a minute. Shall we have that? I think this is great. It's Walt Whitman, Salut au monde, and it's using a kickstart really well, long before Oulipo and long before certain uncreative writers who also use this kind of thing. And it sounds strangely like Allen Ginsberg to me. Anyway, here it is, a little bit of it. I see the Krumman in his hut, and the Dahoman and the Ashanti man in their huts. I see the Turk smoking opium in Aleppo. I see the picturesque crowds at the fairs of Khiva and those of Herat. I see Tehran, I see Muscat and Medina and the intervening sands. I see the caravans toiling onward. I see Egypt and the Egyptians. I see the pyramids and obelisks. I look on chiseled histories, records of conquering kings, dynasties, cut in slabs of sandstone or on granite blocks. I see at Memphis mummy pits containing mummies embalmed, swathed in linen cloth, lined there many centuries. I look on the fallen Theban, the large bald eyes, the side drooping neck, the hands folded across the breast. I see all the menials of the earth laboring. I see all the prisoners in the prisons. I see the defective human bodies of the earth, the blind, the deaf, the dumb, idiots, hunchbacks, lunatics, the pirates, thieves, betrayers, murderers, slave makers of the earth, the helpless infants and the helpless old men and women. I see male and female everywhere. I see the serene brotherhood of philosophes. I see the constructiveness of my race. I see the results of the perseverance and industry of my race. I see ranks, colors, barbarisms, civilizations. I go among them. I mix indiscriminately, and I salute all the inhabitants of the earth. I think it's a beautiful passage. anyway, those are my examples of Oulipo.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you very much, Geert Jan. Are there any questions? I don't know, there aren't any in the chat at the moment. But you can put up your hand if you would like to ask a question. Do you each have a question for the other? I thought you might have.
I have a question that occurred to me this morning as I was thinking about this, was when Oulipo was first set up, it was, and this is sometimes forgotten, it was one of its main intentions was to see how mathematics could help people write, how mathematics could be used to develop new forms of literature. And you can see that mathematical element in some Oulipian things. So Perrec's great novel Life User's Manual is constructed using a number grid, essentially a bit like a magic square, or like the kind of number grids you get in Sudoku. And I was wondering if that mathematical element, which you can find in Oulipo, though it's not there everywhere, it's not, lipograms have nothing to do with that, if there are traces of that in Arabic writings.
I can't think of convincing examples. Of course, there is the playing with chronograms, which I illustrated in the earlier part of today. And then, that's of course, yeah, mathematical, or rather, yeah, that's arithmetic. Apart from that, perhaps it's more geometric than mathematic or arithmetic. When they arrange poems, for instance, in the crossword forms, when you can read poems vertically and horizontally, that sort of thing. That's not really mathematics. There are also ways of encrypting words, very complicated. There's even in the famous Ibn Khaldun, in his introduction to history, there's a long chapter about how to extract a message or a word from a poem. And I never understood how it worked, actually. But it may well be a form of mathematical literature. I'm not sure.
No, so I was interested earlier on today when you mentioned the chronogram, because
yeah,
it's certainly something that some members of Oulipo have tried chronograms, and they take the Roman number system.
Yeah,
so
of
X
course.
becomes 10, C becomes 100, and so on.
It's rather limited, of course. In Arabic, every letter has a single word. And moreover, they did it in verse always, metrical rhyme verse. And believe it or not, there seem to have been people who could improvise chronograms. I can't imagine that myself, but it's attested in the literature. Yeah.
No, so it's a way of encoding the date or the year in the writing.
Usually in a congratulation or with a victory, or people who compose a book, or like a blurb or a puff for a book. When you say this is a wonderful book, you make a laudatory poem, and at the end you say, and it's always introduced with a form of the verb arraga, which means to set a date. So you can always recognize it. And so yeah, it's very popular, but especially in the later Middle Ages, from the 15th century onwards, I would say.
Yeah, and this isn't really a question, but just to say, I was fascinated early on, here, Jan, when you gave us examples of pangrams in Arabic, where all the letters are used, examples of lipograms, whereas if Oulipo are doing this, they will take out a letter, but in Arabic, you've got these, if I understand it, there are letters with dots on them and letters without dots.
Absolutely, yes. And also there are letters that can be joined and letters that cannot be joined to the following letter. And they play with that as well. Yes. So
they play with that, and the lipogram becomes, you do a lipogram in no dotted letters. For example. And you also mentioned palindromes, so things that read the same forwards and backwards. Again, precisely one of the forms Oulipo are really interested in, as well as things like monorhyme. So it's absolutely startling to me to see how many of these things that in a way I've come to associate with Oulipo are there in very ancient.
I should say that the Greeks were first in many ways. The Greeks were often first. And I think the Greek culture sort of filtrated through the Middle East, Alexander the Great and all that later, into Arabic culture, which is not purely Arabic. Of course, it's purely Arabic language, but the culture and the ideas are, well, a mixture, it's a crucible of the Christian and the ancient Greek, and everything. It's a wonderful culture, Arabic, because it's not just the Bedouins in the desert, although of course they are very fond of that, still are.
You know, Parry, when he writes about lipograms, gives us examples of ancient Greek.
Oh, there are some, yes.
But he doesn't mention Arabic writers.
Yeah, there is. I can't remember. There must be something. I don't. All my Greek has been forgotten almost. But I have books about this. Is wonderful 19th century American Bombaugh, who wrote something like Gleanings for the Curious from the Harvest Fields of Literature, and he has hundreds and hundreds of pages of this sort of stuff. And Martin Gardner, the mathematical genius, who wrote for whatever, he wrote a shorter version called Oddities and Curiosities. And this, it wouldn't surprise me if there were some Greek examples in here, but it's mostly based on this Bombaugh, a wonderful name, by the way, Bombaugh. And I've got his Gleanings for the Curious in my computer. It's downloadable. I can heartily recommend it.
Do we have any questions?
Well, perhaps, I don't know if there's time for questions. Perhaps you would like to close, Marina?
I think you've been absolutely sparkling and completely given us so much insights and revelations. But I think it's been a very long day for you.
Well, I could go on.
So I want to thank you both very, very much. I'm sure Wen-chin would like to say a few words, but it's really been a fascinating day. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating day, and thank you both very much for coming. And I've learned so much. So everybody, please applaud